October 1943. Clear skies over Germany. Major Wilhelm Galland smiles on the radio as he sees yet another formation of American bombers crossing the horizon unescorted. For him, that wasn't combat. It was accounting. The Luftwaffe had turned the interception of heavy bombers into a predictable calculation. Frontal attack, concentrated fire, certain drop. The B-17s of the 8th Air Force were treated as slow, unarmed, arrogant targets, and the German fighters as absolute masters of their own airspace. But that trust was built on an illusion that Americans could never fly far enough. No single-engine fighter, the German experts said, would have the autonomy to escort bombers into the heart of the Reich and back. They believed that the skies of Germany were unreachable. The error was not in the calculations, but in the belief that the enemy thought like them. What would come in the following months was not a new tactic, but an industrial response. A streamlined airframe, a British engine, and an extra tank were about to alter the map of the war. This video tells how the pilots who laughed started to flee, and how the P-51 Mustang didn't just escort bombers to Berlin, he escorted the Luftwaffe to extinction. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any image. On October 14, 1943, two 91 B-17 bombers took off for Schweinfurt. By the time the day ended, 77 had been shot down, and another 17 were so badly damaged that they would never fly again. More than 600 airmen did not return. For the Luftwaffe, it was a calculated massacre. For Americans, an open wound. But just 141 days later, those same bombers would return to the skies of Germany, escorted by fighters that, according to all the manuals of the time, could never be there. Berlin looked up and saw the impossible flying in formation. This video is about the gap between those two dates, and what happens when you underestimate a nation capable of turning a technical limitation into a strategic weapon. If you value the story told with accuracy, respect, and depth, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps this channel to continue revealing the real backstage of the war, where numbers decide destinies and ideas change the course of history. Between 1942 and the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe operated with an almost doctrinaire confidence. From the top of their Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, their pilots saw the battlefield with brutal clarity. The American bombers, heavy and slow, entered German airspace unprotected with predictable trajectories limited by rules and outdated technology. For the Germans, it wasn't an air war. It was a harvest. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine had been honed since Spain and the Blitzkrieg. Attack fast, head-on, dive hard, and escape before the counterattack. The frontal assault against B-17 formations, the 12 o'clock position, had become a specialty. That point, located just forward of the fuselage, was the Achilles heel of the American bomber. It was difficult to cover, required fire coordination from the forward gunners, and above all exposed the inline cockpit and engines. The maneuver was deadly. Approach in a straight line in a dive, fire a short burst with 20mm cannons and escape from above or laterally. Hundreds of American crews did not survive this repeated calculation. The Luftwaffe turned attack into a science by distributing detailed manuals and blind spot statistics. The American combat box formation, with as many as 21 bombers protecting each other in layers of 50 caliber machine guns, seemed daunting on paper, but it proved permeable in practice. Coordination between the fighters was enough to saturate the most vulnerable sectors. German pilot Hedman von Koch of JG-11 described, "Their formation looked like a flying porcupine, but every porcupine has a direction that it cannot see." And that's where we entered. With each mission, the Luftwaffe refined its methods. Entire formations of FW-190s executed synchronized attacks from 8 aircraft in line, advancing like an aerial juggernaut. The strength was in surprise, time, and number. And while the Americans were battling the artillery, the German fighters were already returning to bases, refueling, and taking off again to intercept the next squadron. But confidence was not born only from technique. It was reinforced by a cultural conviction that German technology was superior by nature, the result of pure, rational engineering unattainable by decadent powers such as the United States. For Reich strategists, the American challenge was not serious. It was mechanical. They believed that the U.S. Air Force was a bulky but disorganized force, They have metal and gasoline, but they don't have brains, read an internal report from the Air Command. And because of this, the concept of reach was simply not taken seriously. Why build fighters with a range of 1,000 kilometers if the enemy could not go beyond the Ardennes? The war, in the German view, was a territorial dispute. The protection of Germany's heartland would be ensured not by planes flying to England, but by static defensive lines and fighters strategically stationed in the center of the Reich. The Luftwaffe didn't need to catch up with the enemy. It was waiting for him. This belief shaped not only the strategy, but the production. While the United States designed external tanks, refueling systems, and engines optimized for extended flight, the Germans invested in interceptors with a high rate of climb, but with restricted autonomy. The FW-190, for example, was excellent at low altitude and possessed lethal weaponry, but with less than 600 kilometers of useful range, it was limited to short missions. The Bf-109, the model that sustained much of the German air war, suffered chronically from autonomy limitations and was uncomfortable even for experienced pilots. The concept of extended escort, something basic to the Americans, was virtually non-existent in the Luftwaffe. When faced with the first American missions in 1943, the German response was not to expand reach. He laughed at the enemy's limitation, a miscalculation that would soon cease to be theoretical. This technical contempt was accompanied by logistical myopia. By 1943, the United States was producing an average of 2,500 airplanes per month. Germany, in the same period, produced between 700 and 1,000. But the most telling data was not the raw number, it was the growth curve. American production doubled every 18 months, while German production was already showing signs of stagnation. The Luftwaffe did not have the capacity to absorb losses at the same rate that the U.S. had to replace. And yet the Germans continued to view the enemy as clumsy and overrated. In 1943, the United States manufactured 86,000 aircraft, Germany just over 25,000. A difference in scale so colossal that most German officers simply ignored it. By the way, if this difference in production surprised you, comment now with "Logistics wins." This helps us understand how many people actually value the data behind the story. While the Luftwaffe's superiority was projected by experienced pilots, German industry was already showing signs of exhaustion. The doctrine of quality over quantity had worked in 1940, but it was beginning to crumble in 1943 when the war demanded scale, replenishment, and scope. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories could not deliver fighters at the same pace as Boeing, Lockheed, and North American. More seriously, the experienced German pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Each B-17 shot down was costly, but each lost German pilot cost more than the Reich could afford. By the end of 1943, the situation behind the scenes was already alarming but still undeclared. The German High Command maintained the illusion of control. The pilots were still laughing on the radios, and the factories still operated as if the 1940 model was still viable. But silence was approaching. It would come from the west, flying low with tanks under its wings and a new engine in its chest. And when he arrived, he would not announce his presence with fanfares. It would arrive like a whisper of aluminum and turn confidence into despair. Because while the Luftwaffe laughed at the bombers, American engineers were building something that would not only change the war, it would change the sky itself. And the first test flight of this plane had already taken place. While the Luftwaffe established its doctrine on the principle of rapid interception, the American strategy followed a radically opposite and dangerous path. The doctrine of the 8th Air Force, created under the direct influence of the Allied command in 1942, relied on surgical precision as a moral and technical weapon. Bombing during the day in a visible, identifiable, and targeted way was more than an operational choice. It was a statement of principle. America wanted to destroy military, industrial, and logistical targets, not entire cities. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which had sown terror in Coventry and London with indiscriminate night bombings, the United States sought the image of clean warfare, hitting factories, railroad hubs, and refineries with the precision of a scalpel. And for that, they needed light and full visibility. The decision to bomb in broad daylight wasn't just a preference. It was a risky gamble backed by an almost unshakable faith in the defensive power of formation and machine. The B-17 bombers, nicknamed the Flying Fortresses, embodied this vision. With multiple 50-caliber machine gun turrets, reinforced armor, and redundant engines, the B-17s were designed to withstand impacts, maintain formation, and return home even in flames. The combat box structure consisted of multiple layers of bombers flying in interlocking blocks, so that each aircraft protected the flanks and blind spots of the others. In theory, cross-covering fire made any frontal or lateral attack suicidal for enemy fighters. In practice, this symmetry was too complex to sustain in dynamic combat. A small deviation from course, an evasive maneuver, or the loss of a plane due to mechanical failure opened devastating breaches. And the Luftwaffe soon learned to exploit these loopholes with mathematical precision. But the American decision to insist on this model without long-range fighters was not born of ignorance. It was a technological limitation. In 1942 and 1943, no American single-engine fighters could keep up with the bombers into the German countryside and back. The rugged and powerful P-47 Thunderbolt had excellent low and medium-altitude performance, but its combat radius, even with external tanks, barely exceeded 370 miles. The P-38 Lightning, with 2 engines and longer range, suffered constant failures at high altitude, especially in the intense cold of continental Europe. This left the bombers vulnerable at the most critical moment, when crossing the Reich border. It was at this point, known to pilots as the Edge of Hope, that the American fighters turned around, leaving the B-17s and B-24s to fend for themselves, and the German fighters were waiting right there. Not coincidentally, Luftwaffe officers called this point the golden hour. The American strategy persisted even in the face of growing numbers of losses, not out of blind stubbornness but out of lack of option. The industrial war needed to continue. The factories on Long Island and Seattle did not stop. The Air Command believed that, with sufficient critical mass, the bomber formation would itself become an impenetrable fortress. But this theory soon clashed with the brutal reality of Germany's skies. During the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943, 60 bombers were shot down in a single day, 1 in 6 planes, and even then, the attack was repeated in October, and the results were even worse. The crews knew what awaited them. The accounts of American pilots and gunners reveal the quiet terror that set in as the escort fighters disappeared over the horizon. Without cover, the only defense was to maintain formation and pray. Attentive eyes looked for the metallic glow that announced the German fighters coming from the front or diving. The screams on the intercoms were mixed with the cracks of the machine guns. In many formations, gunners exhausted all ammunition before they even crossed the bombing point. Survivors said that flying back to England was like sailing on a leaky ship. Every minute, a wait for the final impact. And even when they did make it back, the scene at English airfields was bleak. Torn fuselages, destroyed engines, bodies covered with tarpaulins. Daylight bombing had turned into an industrial sacrifice, a decision that cost hundreds of lives a week. Still, the High Command insisted. The logic was simple: to destroy the German war machine at its root. And that meant hitting its factories in the heart of the country. It was there that the ball-bearing plants, the synthetic oil refineries, the Messerschmitt, Junkers, and BMW plants were located. Superficially attacking Germany's flanks would not break its military power. It was necessary to enter. And to get in, you had to fly far, much farther than any American fighter had flown up to that time. It was in this moment of strategic desperation that something began to change. A silent but lethal change. While the Luftwaffe was still celebrating the kill statistics, and while the 8th Air Force was counting losses with resignation, a new aircraft began to emerge. Unlike previous models, it was not the result of an adaptation. It was a project from scratch, designed with a singular purpose: to get to where no fighter had gone before, stay in combat, and come back. The limitation of the range was about to be broken, and the doctrine of daytime bombing, until then considered suicidal, was about to be transformed, because at that very moment, in a hangar in Northern California, a slender fuselage was getting a new engine, and, contrary to what the Luftwaffe believed, this plane was not just a response, it was a statement, one that would be read clearly in the skies over Berlin just 4 months later, October 14, 1943, at 10:20 a.m., and the first B-17 formation crossed the border from German airspace toward Schweinfurt. In all, 291 American heavy bombers crossed the sky in 3 waves, with a clear mission: to disrupt the critical production of ball bearings, essential parts for engines, turbines, and mechanical systems throughout the German war machine. But that morning there was no escort. The accompanying P-47s returned when they reached the fuel limit, as usual. The bombers were alone, and the Luftwaffe knew. Hours before the arrival of the B-17s, German radars had already identified the pattern of the mission. Fighters were strategically moved to the planned routes. The response was not an interception. It was a lethal choreography, divided into turns. The first wave of Focke-Wulf 190s attacked head-on. Then the Messerschmitts came down the flanks. By then, fighters that had refueled were already back in combat. In all, the Germans managed to launch more than 300 sorties against the same American force over the course of a few hours. Each bomber squadron flew alone, sustained only by the formation and its 50 guns, which fired incessantly to exhaustion. But even collective firepower was not enough in the face of the enemy's volume and tactics. The gunners, surrounded by smoke and fire, emptied their shells with desperate precision, trying to hit targets that appeared for seconds and disappeared into a hostile sky. Survivor accounts describe moments of utter terror: cockpits on fire, radios muted, engines exploding, and pilots trying to keep their wings level with halves of the dead crew. Most of the losses occurred in the central 2 hours of the mission. The bombers that managed to stay in the air kept moving forward, not because of strategy, but because retreating was just as dangerous as moving forward. Those who returned did so torn apart. Many landed with mangled crews, failing systems, and in some cases corpses still attached to machine gun turrets. The numbers speak for themselves. Of the 291 bombers launched, 60 were destroyed in combat. Another 17, irreparably damaged, would be discarded upon landing. In a single day, the 8th Air Force lost more than 600 airmen, killed, wounded, or captured, a proportion of losses that made the mission unsustainable. On German radio, the messages were celebratory. The Luftwaffe command called the event Peruschießen, a turkey shooting. The comparison was not gratuitous. The bombers advanced slowly, in line, predictable, and defenseless. It was, for the Germans, the pinnacle of air control. But what few realized at the time was that despite the tragedy, the targets in Schweinfurt were hit. Bearing production has fallen. And even more, even in the face of colossal losses, the mission was executed with precision. The bombers had achieved what they came to do, albeit at an unbearable price. The American High Command knew that doctrine was not sustainable without protection. The daylight bombardment was, in practice, defeated. But instead of abandoning it, something more ambitious began to be prepared. In England, engineers analyzed each failure. In the United States, industrialists sped up each assembly line. And at a base in Essex, fighter pilots were introduced to a new aircraft. Still in testing, still in adaptation, but with something that no other fighter had offered until then: range. While the Germans celebrated their statistics, the Americans recalibrated the war. And a month after Black Thursday, the first Mustangs with outboard tanks were ready to go up, because the doctrine would not change. The daylight bombardment would continue. But next time, the sky wouldn't be empty, and the Germans, for the first time, would have company where they swore they would never see her. The story of the P-51 Mustang did not begin with a grand strategic plan, but with an emergency request and a bold response. In 1940, while Britain was resisting the Nazi war machine alone, the RAF was looking for additional fighters to bolster its air defense. They sent a request to North American Aviation, in California, to produce the already known P-40 Warhawk under license. But the company made a counteroffer. Instead of just assembling an old plane, why not design a new one from scratch? The proposal was risky, but it was accepted. In just 117 days, the first prototype of the Mustang was ready. Initially equipped with an Allison engine, the P-51 impressed with its clean design, efficient aerodynamics, and ease of serial production. But it was at low altitude that the plane excelled. Above 15,000 feet, its performance dropped dramatically. Still, the foundation was built: a promising fuselage, a robust structure, and a modular concept that would allow for rapid upgrades. The great turning point would come from the junction of two industrial powers with complementary mentalities. The British proposed something audacious: to install the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang, the same one that gave the Spitfire its legendary maneuverability. The adaptation was not simple, but when completed, it revealed an aerial monster. The new model, designated P-51B, now flew high, fast, and far. It was as fast as the best interceptors, but with a range superior to any single-engine fighter in operation. With auxiliary tanks, it could fly more than 2,800 miles, enough to keep up with bombers back and forth over Germany. For the first time, engineers had reconciled range, speed, and firepower in a single plane. It was a technical paradigm shift. The irony of this story is that the solution has always been in front of them. American technology already allowed for large-scale production. British engineering already mastered high-performance engines. All that was missing was the right junction, and the war with its brutal urgency forced this union. The Mustang, therefore, was not a cabinet invention. It was a marriage of circumstance, necessity, and applied engineering. Its mass production was possible thanks to the American logistics structure, integrated factories, continuous assembly line, standardization of parts, intensive testing. With each new batch, small corrections were made based on real combat data. The plane evolved in real time. In less than a year, C, D, and K versions were already being manufactured. The D in particular would become the symbol of air supremacy. Cockpit with bubble for full visibility, gyro sighting system, and 650 machine guns. A lethal machine, refined by thousands of pilot reports, adjusted according to what the field demanded. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe still operated fighters dating back to the beginning of the war. The Bf-109, although continually upgraded, retained the same basic airframe as in 1937. The FW-190, while formidable, had slower and more complex production. Germany invested in futuristic projects, such as jets and flying wings, but struggled to meet immediate demand. The United States, on the other hand, had created a system where innovation and volume went hand in hand. By the time the P-51 entered full-scale operation in December 1943, more than 1,000 units were ready for combat, and that number would double in a few months. In 1944, every hour a Mustang rolled off the production line. No enemy air force could absorb this pace. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts in depth and detail, show your support, like this video, and subscribe. This helps us to maintain the research effort and to bring to light stories that reveal the power of engineering in times of war. The Mustang was born from improvisation and was shaped by necessity. But when it entered the skies of Europe, it became something bigger, the embodiment of the aerial turnaround. And the Germans, who until then had dominated space with almost absolute control, were about to meet this new predator. A fighter that didn't just hunt, escort, pursue, suffocated, and won. And when the first Mustangs crossed the skies of Germany, in formation with the B-17s, the impact was immediate. Because that morning, for the first time, German fighters saw something they weren't supposed to see. An American single-engine flying over the heart of the Reich. The P-51 Mustang's victory didn't start in the skies. It started in the calculations. While the Luftwaffe was designing aircraft aimed at short intercepts, protected by a network of internal airfields, American engineers were already thinking about air warfare on a continental scale. The Mustang's differential was not top speed, nor raw firepower. It was something less visible and therefore more underrated: reach. The P-51D, equipped with auxiliary tanks, could fly more than 2,600 kilometers. That meant taking off from England, crossing through France, penetrating deep into German airspace, engaging in prolonged combat, and returning. It was, quite literally, an escort ray that ran through the backbone of the Reich. And that changed everything. The engineering behind this range was a triumph of efficiency. The Mustang used a wing with a laminar profile, an aerodynamic innovation that reduced drag and significantly improved performance at cruising speed. Compared to the conventional wing of the P-47, the design of the P-51 required less power to maintain the same speed, which translated into fuel economy and greater range. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, with its two-stage supercharger, maintained optimal performance at high altitudes, where thin air penalized other aircraft. What's more, the P-51's cooling system, based on a controlled flow radiator, helped maintain thermal efficiency on long missions without sacrificing power. In addition to the internal design, the external configuration of the plane was also designed for strength and durability. Disposable external tanks allowed the Mustang to fly to the target with a maximum load of fuel, and to abandon them before combat, restoring its maneuverability. In a typical mission, 2 tanks of 75 gallons each were attached under the wings, adding up to more than 560 additional liters. These tanks could be dropped in seconds with a simple command from the pilot. It was a combination that turned the transport plane into a predator at the very moment when the combat began. This logic was the opposite of what governed the Luftwaffe. The Bf-109, although lethal in maneuvers and respected for its acceleration, had a useful range of only 660 kilometers. The Fw-190 performed slightly better, but was still restricted to Germany's internal defense zone. In strategic terms, the German fighters were guardians of a besieged castle. They flew to the limit, fought hard, and had to return quickly to refuel. When the escort mission extended beyond 400 kilometers, there was simply no cover. It was the famous middle gap, known to all Allied pilots, and exploited intensively by the Germans until 1944. But with the arrival of Mustangs, that void disappeared. For the first time, the bombers were protected from start to finish. The tactical effect was immediate. The Mustang didn't just keep up with the bombers, it preceded them. It swept the sky ahead, intercepting German formations before they even approached. And because it flew at a higher altitude and speed, the P-51 could choose when and how to enter combat. He was a hunter and a bodyguard at the same time. The new American doctrine abandoned the defensive posture. Instead of reacting to the Luftwaffe, the Mustangs now took the initiative. They dispersed formations, pursued isolated targets, attacked enemy airfields during the return. Their very presence on long missions altered German behavior. Luftwaffe pilots began to hesitate. What was once a coordinated offensive turned into cautious evasion. The bombers' safety was not just in immediate coverage, but in pure deterrence. The Mustang's range forced the Germans to fight at a disadvantage, or not fight at all. This geostrategic shift had devastating side effects. The Luftwaffe was forced to redeploy its fighters. Smaller remote bases were activated to try to intercept the Mustangs on outlying routes. Fuel, already scarce, began to be consumed even more quickly. Maintenance has become critical. On each American mission, hundreds of German fighters had to fly multiple sorties at high rotation and were often shot down without even reaching the target. The wear and tear was accelerated, the replacement was slow, and the hope was less and less. In addition, the logistical efficiency of the United States meant that each lost Mustang was replaced in a matter of days. The extra tanks, the spare parts, the spare engines, everything was delivered with industrial precision. Germany, surrounded, bombed, and torn between war priorities, could not compete. Its best engineers were scattered among competing projects, from the V-2 to the first jets. Superiority on paper no longer translated into advantage on the field. By April 1944, the U.S. Air Force was already conducting bombing missions over Berlin, with full coverage of P-51s. Not only that, but Mustangs were now attacking on the ground as well. They swept railway lines, destroyed trains, machine-gunned airfields and fuel trains. The escort fighter became an offensive force in its own right. On each mission, they not only protected lives, they collapsed the enemy's ability to respond. This difference was not ignored by the Germans. In May of that year, an internal Luftwaffe report stated, "The new American fighters don't just keep up with bombers. They protect them, chase ours, and return before we can understand how." A phrase of technical resignation. The era of German air dominance was over, and many still didn't know it. But those who knew, felt. And what would happen in June, in the skies over Normandy, would confirm what was already evident in Germany's quiet hangars. The Luftwaffe was fighting in a sky that no longer belonged to it. And the Mustang, the fighter that shouldn't exist, now flew where no one imagined it was possible. January 1944. The European winter froze the fields of Germany, but the skies began to move differently. On that freezing morning, formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers cut across the horizon toward the industrial heart of the Reich. It was more of a routine mission for Luftwaffe pilots, or so they thought. The interception would follow the pattern. The American P-47s would escort to the usual point, then turn back, and the German fighters would have a free field to attack. It had always been like this. The intelligence reports confirmed it. The bombers came unprotected over German territory, but something was wrong. The first wave of Focke-Wulf 190 took off from Kassel, advanced to the interception point, and prepared for the frontal thrust. It was then that the unexpected appeared on the radar. American single-engine fighters, still glued to the formations, in the middle of Reich airspace. The German controllers thought it was a reading error, but the drivers confirmed over the radio. They're still here. They didn't. They continue with the bombers. The Mustangs had crossed the line. They had entered. And not only that, they began to attack. Unlike the P-47s, which avoided prolonged combat, the P-51s took the offensive. They chose targets, divided German formations, and pursued without hesitation. It was the moment when the predator became prey. To Luftwaffe veterans, that didn't make sense. A single-engine fighter coming from England, crossing all of occupied France, entering the heart of Germany and still engaging in combat with autonomy. There was no precedent. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, an ace of the Luftwaffe, wrote in his diary, "I thought it was stray lightning, but they were in formation, flying with precision. It was a complete escort, and where there was one, there were 10. The technical reports that reached the command in Berlin confirmed what seemed impossible. The Mustangs were flying full escort missions to central Germany. These were not isolated mistakes. They were not navigation accidents. It was doctrine. It was planning. It was a new era beginning in silence. The psychological impact was as great as the tactical one. The German pilots, accustomed to choosing the moment of attack, began to be attacked even before approaching. The Mustang's autonomy allowed it to sweep the flanks, climb to the altitudes of enemy fighters, and descend with superior speed. More than just protecting bombers, Mustangs hunted hunters. It was a complete reversal of the logic that underpinned the Luftwaffe's air superiority. The once familiar sky became hostile. With each mission, more German pilots were shot down not during the attack, but before it. Reaction time decreased. The margin of error disappeared, and with it, confidence. The effect was immediate in the control rooms. Luftwaffe officers began to question the intelligence reports. Some believed that the Americans had set up secret bases in France. Others suggested that the planes were being refueled in mid-air. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. The Americans had created a fighter that did what no other did, and now they used it on a large scale. The logic of zone and range-based air defense was broken. Germany was no longer a sanctuary. The air war was now continuous with no borders, no refuge. And the Mustangs didn't just come to escort. They came back. And on the way back, they destroyed everything they saw. Trains, trucks, communication towers, airstrips, hangars. The air war became an all-out war. At Luftwaffe airfields, tension was rising. Mechanics needed to prepare aircraft with less time. Pilots took off on alert, and sorties no longer had guarantees of return. Each fight with Mustangs left a gap in the chain of command. Experienced pilots were lost without replacement. The statistics began to change. In December 1943, the Luftwaffe still maintained favorable scrapping rates. By March 1944, the number of losses already exceeded the number of victories. And that, in an air force that depended critically on the quality of its men, was the harbinger of collapse. And even so, the production of Mustangs grew. Each week, new units arrived in England. Each day, new pilots learned to fly with a machine made to win. Air combat, which had previously been a dance between equals, became one-sided. American technology had broken the distance barrier. And now, it was beginning to break the psychological resistance of those who still believed in the Reich's air domination. Because what happened that January was more than a meeting. It was a revelation. The skies of Germany no longer belonged to Germany. And soon, not even their ground bases would be safe. February 1944 marked more than the consolidation of the P-51 as an escort fighter. It marked the birth of a new doctrine, offensive, ruthless, continuous. General James Doolittle, now in command of the 8th Air Force, issued a simple and revolutionary order. American fighters were no longer to fly attached to bomber wings. They should hunt, identify, engage, and destroy any Luftwaffe aircraft before they came close to formations. Passive protection gave way to deliberate aggression, and this has turned Mustangs into strategic predators. They didn't just ensure the success of missions, they attacked the enemy's own ability to respond. On each raid, the P-51s now split into mobile squadrons covering the flanks, rising above known Luftwaffe routes, and diving with surgical precision over any ascending German fighters. Many raids occurred when Luftwaffe planes were still gaining altitude after takeoff. Others when they formed a line for the attack. In both cases, the advantage was the Mustang. Altitude, speed, surprise. The Luftwaffe began to operate under siege, with its initiatives intercepted even before they materialized. But the offensive did not stop in the air. With increased range and mission time, the Mustangs began to attack ground targets as well. Armored trains, fuel convoys, airstrips and hangars were swept away by 50 bursts. Freelance missions, where fighters operated independently of bombers, became routine. The goal was clear, not just to escort, but to exhaust the enemy, deprive it of supplies, isolate it from its routes, reduce its supply and training capacity. It was a war of attrition with industrial methodology, and the United States was prepared to sustain it indefinitely. The Luftwaffe did not. With its supply lines collapsing, factories under constant bombardment and mounting human losses, it was forced to turn to younger and younger pilots, with fewer and fewer flight hours. In 1940, a German pilot arrived at the front with 400 hours of training. By 1944, that number had fallen to fewer than 120. Some pilots faced the Mustang with less than 50 hours in fighters. It was a generation thrown to slaughter. Experienced aces were systematically hunted. The rookies, shot down before they even understood the combat. And those who survived returned to increasingly damaged bases, with fewer parts, less fuel, and less confidence. The difference was brutal. On average, the United States produced 2,500 fighters per month. Germany, at its peak, reached just over 1,200. And most of them did not even reach the front line. American logistics operated as a centralized nervous system. Interconnected factories, ships, trains, warehouses fueling the war effort with mathematical precision. Pause for a fact that the Germans ignored until it was too late. Between January and June 1944, the United States produced 16,000 fighter planes, more than the entire Luftwaffe fleet active in that same period. If this number surprised you, write it in the comments. Absolute power. With more planes, more fuel, and more pilots, America could make mistakes and come back stronger. Germany does not. Each defeat was irrecoverable. Each plane lost was a permanent gap. Each pilot shot down, a knowledge that disappeared. And in April 1944, this asymmetry was consolidated into a revealing fact. For the first time, the number of American fighters on daily missions exceeded the total number of operational Luftwaffe fighters. The air dominance had changed hands, and irreversibly, because now, it wasn't just the escort that flew the farthest. It was the offensive power. The Mustang had ceased to be a protective shadow, and had become a surgical scalpel, cutting the arteries of the German Air Force. The Luftwaffe, cornered, began to operate in short, desperate cycles. They gathered small formations, launched sporadic attacks, then retreated. But the Mustangs were always there. In May, American intelligence reports showed that many German squadrons preferred not to take off when they detected the presence of Mustangs on the route. Air superiority was now psychological, and the enemy began to break inside. But the collapse was not yet total. A coup was missing, a direct impact that confirmed before the world and Germany that the sky of the Reich had fallen, and that moment would come in June. Not about factories, not about open fields, but about the beaches of France. Because when the Allies landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe did not respond, and the deafening silence of that sky was the final signature of the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe did not go down with a bang. It fell apart in silence, little by little, corroded by an enemy who gave no rest, who did not retreat and who did not make the same mistakes twice. The P-51 Mustang, more than a fighter, became the agent of a war of attrition that was eroding the backbone of German aviation on three critical fronts: men, fuel, and time. Each of these losses, in itself, would be serious. Together, they were fatal. The number of veteran Luftwaffe pilots began to plummet from early 1944. Until then, it was common to see aces with hundreds of missions under their belt, racking up dozens of victories. But that elite era began to fade as Mustangs began operating at depth. American formations didn't just shoot down fighter jets, they hunted for names. Experienced pilots were identified by their flight patterns, pursued to the end, and eliminated. Every casualty of this kind was irreparable. The United States could train new pilots quickly, as it had fuel, aircraft, and infrastructure. Germany, on the other hand, was already struggling with time, and with the scarcity of everything. The training of new German pilots was shortened to the point of tragedy. In 1940, the average training time was 250 to 400 hours. By 1944, it had fallen to less than 120. In the last months of the war, there were cases of pilots sent to the front with only 40 total hours, facing American veterans with more than 300. A German lieutenant captured in July 1944 revealed under interrogation that he had flown only 3 times in a Bf-109 before being sent to intercept bombers. He described the feeling as walking into a ring blindfolded against a professional boxer, and that was exactly it. The Mustang wasn't just better as an aircraft. It was flown by men who flew more, trained more, and survived longer. With each combat, this cycle was reinforced. But even the most experienced pilots couldn't fly without fuel, and the Luftwaffe began to feel this intensely after the start of the Allied attacks on its energy infrastructure. The synthetic oil refineries in Luna, Pulitz, and Blechhammer became priority targets. On surgical missions, American bombers, protected by Mustangs, destroyed depots, tanks, pipelines, and coal conversion centers. Germany's aviation fuel production fell by 90% between May and September 1944. This meant that even when the fighters were ready, they could not take off. Many missions were canceled due to a lack of kerosene. Entire squadrons were redeployed just to save a few hundred liters. The Mustangs kept flying, the Germans waiting. The consequences piled up. Fewer flights meant less training. Less training meant more losses. More losses meant less experience. The Luftwaffe entered a downward spiral that no doctrine could contain. Hermann Göring himself, commander of the German Air Force, declared in September, "If our planes don't take off, our weapons are on the ground." And on the ground, they were being destroyed. The Mustangs machine-gunned runways, hangars, parked planes. Every American mission was now a cleanup operation, systematic and brutal. And all this with relatively low operating costs for the United States. Allied logistics was a machine. For every Mustang shot down, 3 others took its place. With each pilot lost, a new officer had already been trained with an updated manual, recent combat data, and state-of-the-art equipment. It was the difference between an army with resources and an army surviving on improvisation. The psychological impact was devastating. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with absolute confidence, now flew under permanent tension. The pilots knew they were at a disadvantage. They knew that even if they escaped the bombers, they would have to face fighters superior in range, number, and altitude. Freedom of choice had disappeared. The Luftwaffe no longer chose when to fight. It just tried not to die. An internal German report classified the state of the air units as operationally compromised. It was a euphemism for collapse. And behind it all, silent and constant, was the Mustang. Fast enough to surprise, light enough to fly far, heavy enough to kill. It was not the only fighter of the war, but it was the fighter that dismantled an air empire. And he did it without speeches, without exhibitions, just flying. Mission after mission, machine gun after machine gun. From March to August 1944, P-51s destroyed more than 4,000 enemy planes in the air. In the same period, the Luftwaffe lost 2/3 of its veteran pilots, and the number of operational German planes fell by 60%. The Luftwaffe did not fall in a day. It was torn apart in 1,000 cuts. Each American mission was another blow. Every Mustang, an instrument. And every time a German pilot looked up at the sky and saw that colorful-nosed fighter flying where it shouldn't be, one certainty grew. The end was already up there. But the moment that would prove this truth before the entire planet was yet to come. Because soon the eyes of the world would be on a gray coast in France, and the silence in the skies would be more eloquent than any explosion. On the morning of March 4th, 1944, the skies over Germany witnessed a sharp cut in the line between myth and reality. For the first time, American bombers didn't just cross the boundaries of German territory, they crossed the very pride of the Reich, Berlin. But that was not what caused surprise. Bombers had hit the outskirts of the city before, in isolated and costly attacks. What made this day go down in history was what accompanied them, the P-51 Mustang. Not in small groups, not as a return patrol. There were dozens in formation, flying side by side with the B-17s to the heart of Nazi Germany, and back. For the first time, the Reich capital was flown over by heavy bombers with full escort. The world's most protected airspace had been violated, not by isolated daring but by methodical planning. It was a new doctrine imposing itself. No part of Germany was safe. No altitude, no distance, no myth of invulnerability. What the Germans considered a technical impossibility, the presence of American single-engine fighters over Berlin, was now a routine in the making. The mission that day was aimed at the Siemens motor-bearing plant north of Berlin, but the real impact was symbolic, because every Mustang that crossed the Berlin sky was a visual reminder that the war had shifted its axis. The domain that once belonged to the Luftwaffe was now in the hands of American industry. Hermann Göring himself, in a private conversation recorded by close officials, acknowledged, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew that the war was lost." It was not a metaphor. It was the bitter and objective realization that all strategic calculations were outdated. The idea that the Reich was untouchable by enemy fighters, defended for years in the corridors of the High Command, had been dispelled in a single flight. The mission met resistance, but not at the level the Luftwaffe intended. The surprise factor was with the Americans. The German fighters, still reorganizing after catastrophic losses in the previous months, were caught in a bad position. They attempted to intercept, but were held back by the Mustangs with superior maneuvers and precise strikes. The new reality was clear. The B-17s were, for the first time, truly protected. The effectiveness of the bombardment no longer depended on luck. It depended on industrial consistency. And that, the United States had in abundance. The P-51s operated in shifts, coordinated by radio and distributed by altitude. While some were directly escorting, others were hunting for German approaches, and others were already flying over the way back. It was a closed, integrated system, with constant pressure. Mustangs are no longer just air defense. They have become part of the offensive system. The psychological impact on the German civilian population was immediate. The Berlin sky, for years a symbol of power and control, was now torn by formations of bombers with visible escorts. It was as if the enemy was marching through the heart of the capital, only from above. Sirens sounded in vain. Few interceptors took off, and even those who managed to take off were no longer sure if they would return. Trust was broken, and the breakdown of this confidence had profound effects. In the following days, industrial production fell. Rail transport was paralyzed. Officers began moving files and equipment out of town. The mere presence of Mustangs over Berlin altered strategic decisions, because now, the capital was a constant target, and this mission was no exception. It was the beginning of a new phase. In the following months, the presence of the P-51s on deep missions became standard. More and more bombers could operate without catastrophic losses. German factories, once protected by distances and elite fighters, were now exposed. And every Mustang that flew over Berlin was a reminder that there was no turning back. The air war had ceased to be a contest for advantage, and had become an occupation of the skies. The difference was in scale, in reach, in production, and Germany had no way to keep up. The sky over Berlin had been the ultimate symbol of Reich air safety for 5 years. Now it became the showcase of German strategic collapse. And every citizen who looked up didn't just see airplanes. He saw the naked truth of war. It was being lost from the top down, because if Mustangs could fly all the way to Berlin, they could fly anywhere. And the question that hung in the air was no longer how to protect ourselves, but when will the next attack be? But there was still a number that remained to be revealed, a fact that would put everything in perspective. How much real strength the Luftwaffe still had to resist this new era. And that answer would come soon, with the same coolness that Mustangs used when cutting through the sky. With the presence of Mustangs becoming routine in the skies over the Reich, the German High Command realized that its doctrine of technical superiority and precise attack had become obsolete. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of military innovation, now struggled with the logic of desperation. There was no more time for long-term plans or industrial innovations. It was necessary to resist with what we had. In response to the new reality, the so-called Gruppensturm, heavy attack groups formed by modified Focke-Wulf 190 fighters emerged. They were given additional armor plates, reinforced armament, and clear orders. Breakthrough bomber formations at any cost, even if it meant deliberate collision. The Luftwaffe abandoned the finesse of aerial combat for brutal, almost suicidal attacks. It was the antithesis of everything they had preached in the years of domination. The Sturm groups flew in closed blocks, tried to penetrate the combat boxes of the B-17s with massive bursts, and, if necessary, crashed into the aircraft. For every one that made it to the bombers, 3 or 4 were shot down by the Mustangs that guarded the flanks and rear. The result was predictable: very high losses, minimal tactical gains. In parallel, mass tactics were tested. Entire formations of Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters were dropped in concentrated sorties against a single point of the American formations. The idea was to overwhelm the defense, breach the 50 wall, and deal significant damage before the Mustangs intervened. But the reaction time of the Allied fighters was short. Thanks to radio coordination, higher altitude, and airspace mastery, the P-51s anticipated almost all formations. By identifying the pattern of attacks, they adapted their routes and divided themselves into tactical layers. While one group remained close to the bombers, another patrolled at higher altitude, ready to dive as soon as the Luftwaffe emerged. Germany was still trying to play chess, but the Americans had already changed the board. Instead of responding to attacks, Allied fighters now predicted them. The impact wasn't just numerical, it was doctrinal. The very core of German air ideology was beginning to crumble. Since the 1930s, the Luftwaffe had believed in technical quality, tactical superiority, and the elite as the decisive force. Now, all this was confronted by a simpler and crueler reality. The adversary flew more, produced more, attacked more, and did not tire. The notion of superior men in superior machines gave way to the realization that war, at this stage, was won by scale, repetition, and adaptation. And in this field, the United States was unbeatable. In April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 56% of its frontline fighters. The following month, this number rose to 70%. The Sturm groups, even when they managed to break formations, returned with half the pilots. And the German factories were no longer able to replace men, machines, or parts. Fuel, which was already scarce, began to be rationed at operational levels. Missions were canceled due to lack of aviation kerosene. Many drivers were not even able to carry out basic training. A Luftwaffe instructor reported, "We trained with maps. We show you pictures of Mustangs and say, if you see this, take the plunge, or run." The psychology of combat had changed. You no longer flew to win, you flew to survive. German fighters avoided contact whenever possible. They intercepted only when the orders were direct and unavoidable. The German air war had become a belated reaction, without initiative, without advantage, without future. And in this scenario, every Mustang in the sky acted as a reminder of an inescapable reality. The Luftwaffe was losing, even as it tried to fight. The wear and tear wasn't just physical, it was moral. What was once pride was now a burden. What was once trust was now radio silence. At a crisis meeting in the summer of 1944, a Luftwaffe officer, when asked what could be done, replied bitterly, "We can retreat to the ground, and yet they will come." Because Mustangs were no longer just hunting planes. They were dismantling a belief system, a strategic architecture, an illusion of superiority that Germany had cultivated for years. The German reaction was real, intense, desperate, but it was too late. The air war was no longer decided in the cockpit. It was decided on the assembly line, the range of auxiliary tanks, the integration of tactics, and the willingness to wage war without rest, without fear of distance, and without the need for immediate return. Germany's skies, which for so long had served as a symbolic and strategic shield, were now just access corridors for Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe did not lose due to design inferiority. He lost because he believed that the world would stop in 1940, and when he tried to chase it, there was no longer a clue. But the final blow would not come from a formation, nor from a tactic. It would come from an absence, of an emptiness, and it would be felt not in factories nor in battles, but on the beaches, where for the first time the Luftwaffe simply did not appear. Between February 20th and 25, 1944, the skies of Europe witnessed the beginning of the end of the Luftwaffe as a strategic force. The operation was named Big Week, the Big Week, and that name was no exaggeration. It was an air campaign meticulously planned to do exactly what it promised, to crush the heart of the German aircraft industry. For 6 consecutive days, the U.S. Air Forces launched more than 3,500 bombers, protected by some 2,500 escort fighters, on the most sensitive targets of the Reich war effort. The factories of Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Junkers, and Daimler-Benz were bombed with surgical precision, now feasible thanks to the sustained flight of the P-51 Mustang into the German countryside. For the first time, it was possible to carry out deep, systematic strikes without sacrificing hundreds of bombers, and without having to negotiate with luck. It was pure strategy, with logistical support and full coverage. The Luftwaffe, cornered, had to react. Throughout the week, he threw out all his available resources to try to stop the Allied advance. More than 2,000 fighters have been mobilized, many of them manned by young people with less than 100 hours of flight time. The elite of 1940 had been almost entirely lost in previous months. Now it was the apprentices who supported the line. But it was not a fair dispute. Mustangs were everywhere. They intercepted formations before they approached the bombers, dived from the clouds with superior speed, chose the battlefield and the timing of the attack. During the Great Week, more than 500 German fighters were shot down. And more than machines, what was lost was something irreplaceable: the experienced drivers. The statistics are clear. In the 6 days of operation, the Luftwaffe lost more veteran pilots than at any other time during the war. The mathematics of war at that point became a sentence. The United States produced about 2,600 planes a month. Germany, in February 1944, barely exceeded 1,200. Even more. While the Americans lost planes and already had others ready on the assembly line, Germany struggled to replace damaged parts, reorganize factories displaced by bombing, and train new crew members. With each German fighter shot down, another Mustang appeared in the sky, with a trained pilot, guaranteed fuel, and a clear mission. And most surprisingly, each month, the United States was increasing production. By 1944, the country would manufacture nearly 100,000 military aircraft, a number that sounded absurd to German intelligence. Pause for a fact. In that same February 1944, the U.S. produced 10 times more fighters than Germany. Yes, 10 times. If you were surprised by this, comment below. Logistics wins, because in the end, that's exactly what happened. During Big Week, it wasn't just factories that were destroyed, it was the air defense system as a whole. Communications were compromised, secondary runways were bombed, parts and fuel depots were set on fire. And all this under an escort that seemed not to run out. The concept of air supremacy was beginning to take on a new definition. It wasn't just about having more planes in the sky. It was about preventing the enemy from even daring to go up. And the Mustangs were accomplishing just that. By the end of the operation, internal German reports acknowledged that the damage to the production infrastructure had been very serious and irreversible in the short term. But there was something even deeper going on. For the first time, the Luftwaffe command began to openly discuss the possibility of functional collapse. It was no longer a question of resisting with new tactics, but of trying to survive the following week. General Galland, one of the most respected aces in the German Air Force, confessed in a restricted meeting that the situation was akin to trying to stop a bleeding with a knitting needle. Within 6 days, the United States had destroyed what Germany had taken years to assemble, and with no signs of retreating. Big Week was more than a military operation. It was a demonstration of industrial capacity transformed into a strategic weapon, and he proved that, in the field of air warfare, will does not replace infrastructure. Courage is no substitute for kerosene. Technique does not replace scale. Mustangs didn't win because they were invincible. They won because they flew with an entire system behind them. A system that started with crude steel, went through factories in 3 shifts, and ended with pilots receiving updated instructions with each mission. It was scientific, mechanized, rational warfare, and completely out of German reach at that stage. The immediate effect of Big Week was felt in the skies and in the factories, but the lasting effect would be felt in June, when the Allies would decide to open a new chapter in the war. Because to land in Normandy, you would need clear skies. And when that day came, the absence of the Luftwaffe would speak louder than any presence. In the preserved archives of the Luftwaffe, far from official communiques and propaganda bulletins, a somber and silent portrait of the air war in the final months of 1944 emerges. They are personal letters, Excerpts from diaries, reports from commanders censored or never published. In them, the tone is always the same: discouragement. The war, once synonymous with technical glory and fiery patriotism, had become a mechanical wait for the next mission, and for many, the next downfall. A young pilot, with only 41 hours of flight time, writes to his mother, "I am not afraid to fly. I'm afraid I won't come back, and every day here seems to me the last." Another, more experienced, already hopeless, sums up in one sentence what many felt: "Mustangs don't fly, they wait. They expect us to go up, and then they hunt us." This perception of the ubiquity of Allied fighters wasn't just emotional, it was real. With the air freedom won by the 8th Air Force, Mustangs began patrolling transport routes, airfields, and even secondary airfields. A German pilot reported that when he tried to take off with a Bf-109, he was already a target even before retracting the landing gear. Air supremacy had been replaced by a more ruthless kind of dominance: constant surveillance. American fighters are no longer seen as adversaries, and are now read as invisible predators always on the lookout. It was common, in the reports of the time, the word shadow to describe them. "We flew with the shadow of the Mustangs over us," wrote a base commander in Western Germany. The psychological result of this new reality was devastating. The young men who arrived to join the ranks of the Luftwaffe no longer received the rights of pride of the early years of the war. They received maps, quick orders, hasty training, and often silent farewells. On average, a new German pilot in 1944 survived fewer than 2 full missions. The cycle was cruel. The experienced pilot died. The replacement was hastily trained, and the Mustang waited. With each takeoff, the chances of returning decreased. The Luftwaffe was fighting an air force that seemed to have overcome the human factor. It flew more, missed less, had more fuel, more parts, more information, and more time. In the letters intercepted by Allied intelligence services, references to the desire to surrender, impotence in the face of a phantom force, and loss of purpose multiplied. One soldier wrote, "We don't know what we are fighting for anymore. We fight because they tell us to go up, but we don't choose when to fall." The constant presence of Mustangs imposed a form of psychological punishment unheard of in modern air warfare. Even when the Germans were not attacked, they were watched. Even when they were not slaughtered, they were persecuted. The feeling of fragility has become the norm. What began as a technical game between engineers and combat tactics had turned into an invisible battle against fatigue, fear, and the certainty that the enemy was flying overhead. Always. The psychological breakdown didn't just affect the pilots. Defense mechanisms, such as attempts to hide airfields or camouflage hangars, became symbolic gestures of a fight that could no longer be won. Fuel was rationed even for ground training. Pilots were encouraged to imagine the flight before performing it. Logbooks were filled with precision, but empty of hope. The reports became shorter, drier, harsher. There was a war, yes, but it was no longer fought with weapons. It was stuck in the silence of takeoffs with no return. Behind the scenes of the high command, the Luftwaffe already knew. The backbone of the Air Force had been broken not just by bombs and bullets, but by time and repetition. The American ability to maintain constant pressure had turned every German flight into a statistical sentence. By June 1944, the number of pilots shot down had surpassed the number of new graduates, an equation that not even propaganda could camouflage. And as D-Day approached, something deeper revealed itself. The Luftwaffe's absence from the beaches of Normandy was not a planning error. It was a direct reflection of what the Mustangs had done in the skies months earlier. The night before the invasion, only 319 operational fighters were available in all of northern France, and of those fewer than 90 took off. Because every Mustang that escorted a bomber, that machine-gunned a train that flew over an empty field, it was a German pilot that didn't take off. The war was being won in the space between the ground and the sky, and the Luftwaffe, which once dictated the rules of this space, now begged to survive it. But history still held one last irony. Because while the Germans were writing farewell letters, the Americans were writing manuals, occupation manuals, and Berlin was still on the horizon. When the P-51 Mustang was designed, its primary mission was clear: to protect bombers, escort them to the targets, and bring them back alive. But like any weapon forged in war, the Mustang has evolved, and evolved fast. In less than a year, What was a defensive aircraft turned into the tactical nightmare of the German rearguard. The autonomy that allowed it to fly to Berlin also allowed low-flying patrols to be carried out over hundreds of miles of enemy territory. And when fighter jets began attacking not only planes but also infrastructure, Germany discovered that the sky wasn't just a threat, it was a lump tightening in its throat. Mustangs began to carry rockets, 250 and 500-pound bombs, and extra tanks that could be dropped before combat. Equipped with 50 machine guns, they were capable of destroying entire convoys, strafing locomotives, knocking down control towers, and paralyzing railway stations in minutes. The tactic was simple and brutal. Fly over supply lines, identify moving or fixed targets, dive at speed, and attack with precision. Then, disappear. There was no effective defense against this. Anti-aircraft guns tried to react, but the Mustangs came too low and too fast. Trains carrying coal, steel, parts, and soldiers came to be seen as primary targets. All it took was a well-positioned gust, and the rails turned into twisted iron. In April 1944, a single squadron destroyed 17 locomotives in one morning, at different points in Bavaria. Trains, once synonymous with German industrial efficiency, now carried the risk of never reaching their destination. Factories have also become constant targets, but no longer with high-altitude bombings. Now, the attacks came from below. Mustangs identified critical areas, electrical substations, oil depots, rail connections, and attacked with surgical punctuality. It was the fusion of American engineering and Allied intelligence accuracy. In a report from the time, an SS officer wrote, "They attack as if they know where every bolt is." And they knew. Allied air superiority now meant total control of space and time. Nothing else could be moved in Germany without risk. Trucks, buses, military columns, even agricultural tractors were attacked on secondary routes. There was no secure border, no neutral zone. The entire country had become a target. The effect was immediate. Logistical delays multiplied. Factories interrupted shifts due to lack of raw materials. Military bases ran out of fuel. The Mustangs were strangling the German war machine from the base, and they did it with an almost industrial efficiency. The missions were organized and crossed routes at different times to maintain constant pressure. On some railway stretches, there were records of 3 separate attacks on the same day, at different points. And even when targets were hit, the Mustangs remained in the region, circling at altitude and searching for survivors or secondary targets. It was the doctrine of saturation applied with tactical precision. The Mustang didn't just hunt, it imposed a logic of fear and paralysis. An internal report by the Reichsbahn, the German railway system, revealed that more than 35% of the national network had become inoperable or at high risk by the summer of 1944. And it wasn't just physical infrastructure. It was also the absence of drivers, the shortage of spare parts, and widespread fear among operators. A time-bound witness in charge of locomotive maintenance said, "We worked by listening to the sky. The noise of the engine was more feared than the sound of the siren. Because the Mustangs didn't announce their arrival, they appeared, attacked, and disappeared. Modern warfare had descended from the clouds to rail level, and no one was ready for that." In the countryside, agricultural production was also affected. The distribution of fertilizers, seeds, and even fuel for tractors was interrupted. With trucks becoming moving targets, rural transport has all but come to a standstill. The impact on food was immediate. Cities began to register shortages, queues, and forced rationing. Hunger, which until then had been controlled, began to appear in the population's daily newspapers. In a single month, the number of trucks destroyed by Allied fighters exceeded the monthly output of German industry. And most disturbingly, many of these attacks were carried out by fighters that had left bases in England, flown into the German countryside, attacked and returned non-stop. It was the end of the line. Literally. The P-51 had gone from being just a tactical response to becoming a strategic weapon, a vector of disorganization. And this happened not because it was indestructible, but because it flew with the weight of an entire industrial machine behind it. The Mustang was just the visible tip of an invisible gear. The production at scale, the logistics of parts, the shared intelligence, the ability to adapt. Germany was still trying to fight back with what it had: fast fighters, desperate tactics, rhetoric of resistance. But there was no longer a structure to support this answer. The country, attacked from within and without, could no longer walk, nor fly, nor feed its army. And in the midst of this logistical collapse, a new front was formed, one that would not attack factories, nor trains, but symbols. Because to break a nation, sometimes you have to aim for pride, and the Mustangs were about to do just that. In the corridors of the Luftwaffe, in the bunkers of the General Staff, and in the factories that were still trying to operate under ruins and rubble, a brutal truth loomed large. It was not the steel that was running low, nor the munitions, nor the planes. It was the fuel. Nazi Germany, dependent on domestic production and a sophisticated synthetic refining system, had built a war machine that burned more than it could replenish. And when Mustangs proceeded to escort bombers safely into the industrial heartlands of the Reich, that vulnerability was exposed with surgical precision. From the summer of 1944, the targets were no longer just factories and logistics centers. Now, refineries were in the crosshairs. The Leuna, Merseburg, Berlin, and Purlitz units, which produced the vital synthetic fuel, became epicenters of a new phase of air warfare. It wasn't just destruction, it was strangulation. With the dominance of the airspace guaranteed by the Mustangs, the B-17 and B-24 formations could operate with depth and focus. Bombing raids were no longer lost on generic targets. They were precise, constant, and coordinated. In June 1944, the monthly production of aviation fuel in Germany was 175,000 tons. 6 months later, that number had plummeted to less than 10,000, a collapse of more than 90%. The impact was immediate. Entire bases were forced to reduce sorties. Aircraft were kept on the ground for weeks, waiting for shipments that never arrived. And the most serious thing, the remaining fuel needed to be rationed between combat, training, and defense. It was like choosing which part of the body could still function while the rest died. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Luftwaffe, which has invested so much in armor, speed, and maneuverability, ignored the simplest lesson of modern warfare. Without logistics, there is no superiority. And if you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this. Because each number reveals a hidden truth. With the energy collapse, the consequences multiplied in a chain. Pilots who had recently arrived at the bases were no longer given flight hours for training. Many were sent into combat after only 2 or 3 instructional flights. Reports from the field indicate that some novices took to the air without ever having practiced evasive maneuvers or actual engagement. They were targets, and they knew it. The commanders tried to compensate for the shortage with ideological speeches and paper manuals. But heaven did not obey words. It obeyed power, range, and fuel. Mechanized divisions also began to suffer. Without diesel and gasoline, trucks stopped in the middle of the roads. Tanks were abandoned due to lack of supply. In many cases, entire columns became fixed targets for Allied fighter bombers. The Mustang, which had previously only flown alongside the bombers, now circled at low altitude in search of paralyzed columns and destroyed them one by one. War ceased to be a battlefield and became a slow and progressive asphyxiation. Reports from the OKW, the High Command of the German Armed Forces, increasingly recorded expressions such as inoperative, unrecoverable, or restricted by lack of fuel. It was no longer a matter of bravery or discipline, it was mathematics. And she was against the Reich. A short-duration air fighter operation consumed, on average, 400 liters of avgas per mission. Within a month, with reduced production numbers, the Luftwaffe could only supply a fraction of that. Flying has become a rare privilege and an almost certain risk. Even the elite units began to suffer. The Jagdgeschwader, once a benchmark for technical dominance, saw their veteran aces disappear. Not just dead, but inactive, waiting for maintenance or fuel. Mustangs, on the other hand, flew in ever-increasing numbers. American production, supplied by pristine refineries, operated with a surplus. Allied fuel didn't come from factories surrounded by ruins. It came from safe harbors, steady ships, and an oceanic supply chain. While Germany produced in desperation, the United States resupplied in series. The final effect was the quiet dissolution of an air force that, by 1939, was the most advanced in the world. The Luftwaffe, which had revolutionized the concept of air warfare with the Blitzkrieg, now watched its own collapse with its wings on the ground. Not because its drivers gave up, but because their engines were dry, and because the enemy has understood something that German ideology ignored. The real fight is won before takeoff, with logistics, with fuel, with coordination, and with long-term planning. And it was in this context that a new decision was made. If Germany could no longer fuel its planes, perhaps it could not protect its greatest technological hopes either, because in the midst of desperation, the Reich was still betting everything on a new project. One last letter, a promise of superiority. But Mustangs were already on their way, and not even the German jet would escape what would come next. In late 1944, with the Reich collapsing by land and air, Hitler authorized the use of his most ambitious projects, the Me-262 jet fighters and the revolutionary Me-163 Comet manned rockets. They were promises of absolute technical superiority, weapons that could, in theory, turn the tide. The Me-262 flew at over 850 km/h, almost 200 km/h faster than any Allied fighter. His speed was such that bombers seemed motionless in front of him. The Comet, on the other hand, propelled by a rocket, reached altitudes and speeds never seen in combat. These were real advances, technological leaps that would change the course of aviation in the following decades. But in 1944, it was not enough to fly fast. It was necessary to take off, land, refuel, train pilots, and maintain logistics. And in that, Germany had nothing left. The Me-262s were vulnerable at their most critical moment. On the ground, they needed long, clean runways. They needed trained mechanics, specific fuel and time. None of this existed. The Mustangs knew it, and they expected it. They patrolled the surroundings of the jet bases, attacked during taxiing, during approach, after landing. The noise of a turbojet engine on the runway was enough for American planes to dive over it like birds of prey. The numbers are indisputable. On several occasions, more than half of the Me-262s shot down were destroyed on the ground. Even when they did manage to take off, they lacked experienced pilots. Many of the young men assigned to operate the jets had never fought before. They did not understand the limits of the machine, the ideal firing time, or the evasion tactic. They had speed, but they had no doctrine. The Comet, even more exotic, was almost suicidal. With unstable fuel, autonomy of minutes, and inability to engage for a long time, it became a spectacle more than a threat. The few bombers it shot down did not compensate for the operational risks, and often the pilots themselves died in takeoff or landing accidents. Germany had bet on weapons without the structure to support them. It was the embodiment of the Nazi doctrine: isolated genius without the logistic core to give it a long life. Meanwhile, the United States continued to produce Mustangs. By April 1945, total production had already exceeded 15,000 units. Each aircraft with interchangeable parts, guaranteed fuel, series-trained pilots, each squad with reserves, maintenance, and continuous rotation. For every Me-262, there were dozens of Mustangs, and it wasn't enough to have a faster machine. The sky had become a network, and the Mustangs, its firm knots. Even when the jets managed to escape, they made no strategic impact. Bombers continued to arrive, targets were destroyed, and the Luftwaffe dwindled. Hermann Göring, who had once promised that no bomb would fall on the Reich, now watched his most advanced fighters destroyed before they had even proven their effectiveness. In a rare post-war interview, Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces, said bitterly, "We had the right jets, but at the wrong time and in the wrong place. No fuel, no protection on the ground, and with enemies waiting in the clouds." It was the epitaph of unsupported technical superiority. The Germans created the future, but lost the present. Each Me-262 shot down was more than a military loss. It was a brutal reminder that war is not won with innovation alone. You win with structure, coordination, and production. And in this, the Reich had been crushed. Because while the Germans were building a jet, the Americans were producing 100 conventional fighters, with range, reliability, and number. The Mustang wasn't the fastest airplane. It was the most present plane. And this presence, maintained by ships, rails, refineries, and factories, decided the game. Hitler's secret weapons arrived, but they did not change fate. They were dazzling on paper, brief in the air, and silent in their concrete tombs. And all the while, the Mustangs continued to fly over cities, cutting columns, destroying runways, and ensuring the end of the Reich, flight after flight. But there was still one last component to this siege, a link that completed the American gear. Because behind the Mustangs and the bombers there was an even bigger machine, one that decided where, when, and how to attack. It wasn't an airplane, it was a concept, and he would transform war forever. By 1945, the war in the skies of Europe was no longer combat. It was arithmetic. The numbers spoke louder than any propaganda, and the equation was simple. The United States had turned industrial superiority into an absolute weapon. During the previous year, the Americans produced more than 38,000 military aircraft. Germany, under constant bombardment, with destroyed factories and scarce raw materials, produced just over 7,000. But the impact wasn't just on production, it was on replacement. For every German pilot shot down, the United States trained 3. For every Mustang lost, 2 more were already in transit to Europe. The air war had become an execution because the Germans could no longer replace what they lost. And they lost every day. The Luftwaffe's kill rate, which in 1940 was more than 5 enemies for every plane lost, fell to 1 to 3 in 1944, and sank to 1 to 6 in 1945. The veteran aces, who held this advantage, were either dead or wounded. His replacements, young people with less than 50 hours of flight time, faced enemies with hundreds of combats under their belts. The mortality rate of these novices exceeded 80% in the first missions. The German fighters had no more fuel to train, no spare parts, and no air cover during landing. The air defense system, once articulated and lethal, was now just a line of improvisations. The Mustangs, taking advantage of the absence of consistent opposition, hunted coolly. They attacked airfields, destroyed hangars, set fire to ammunition depots. It was a systematic process of elimination. In logistical terms, American superiority was even more brutal. A squadron of P-51s operated with the support of mechanics, radio operators, meteorologists, transporters, commanders, medical services, and double reserves. Each mission was preceded by weather analysis, photographic intelligence, full maintenance, and redundant fueling. On the other side, the German units improvised. There was a lack of radios, there were no maps, there was a lack of basic parts. In many cases, attack orders were transmitted by messengers or landline, vulnerable to cuts and delays. American pilots, in turn, flew with precise coordinates, logistical support, and unified command. When one pilot crashed, another was ready to replace him. By the time one fighter was lost, the factory had already produced the next. This disparity was not limited to the battlefield. Behind the scenes of the war, the United States had transformed itself into a civilization focused on mass production. While Germany fought on multiple fronts, the U.S. kept its infrastructure intact. Their trains transported steel, rubber, and fuel from coast to coast. Its ports dumped ships with dismantled fighters in England and France. Its factories operated in 3 shifts, supplied by a global supply chain. It was more than a war between planes. It was a war between systems. And one of the systems had been designed to last, endure, and scale. The other, built on blitzes and quick victories, could not resist the slowness of the logistical siege. American intelligence reports made it clear. The Luftwaffe was no longer a strategic threat. It was a fragmented force operating in pockets with poor communication and no ability to react coordinately. Even the remaining planes, such as jet fighters, became irrelevant. Without escort, without support, and with demoralized pilots, they were shot down or destroyed on the ground before they made a difference. The Mustang's mission was now almost silent, to ensure that no new air-resistant centers emerged. They flew with full autonomy, attacking not only military targets but also supporting infrastructure, railroad stations, power plants, repair depots. It was the American method in its purest form: industrial, methodical, ruthless. And for the Luftwaffe officers who still survived, there remained bitter recognition. In an intercepted report in early 1945, a commander wrote, "Our pilots now only take off to die. American superiority is not in the planes. It's in the fact that they can lose as many as they want and keep attacking." A short sentence, but one that summed up the spirit of that moment. The Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a target, because in the end, the air war over Germany became a laboratory of efficiency. Each mission of the Mustangs was living proof that logistics, Production and reach win more battles than heroism alone, and there was still one final mission to be accomplished, an attack that would show the world that even with the enemy on the ground, the sky was still a weapon. Between 1944 and 1945, the skies of Europe witnessed a brutal transformation, from strategic battle to systematic execution. The protagonist of this transition was clear: the P-51 Mustang. There were 486 units produced in just one peak month. Each of them was equipped with external tanks, 50 caliber machine guns, extended range, and pilots trained by a system that turned like clockwork. And each Mustang didn't fly alone. It flew with the weight of a nation that had become a powerhouse of war. By the end of the air campaign against the Reich, the Mustangs had more than 4,900 confirmed aerial victories. On the ground, they destroyed more than 4,000 targets, including locomotives, trucks, hangars, radars, and fuel depots. The statistic that shocked the German high command came in 1945. The Mustang recorded a ratio of 11 kills for each loss. The Luftwaffe, already without blood, without lungs, and without nerves, was just trying to survive. The figures on the German side reveal the slow-motion collapse. 12,000 pilots lost in 1944, 4,000 more by May 1945. And it wasn't just soldiers. They were men who brought with them years of experience, tactical reading, technical mastery, replaced by recruits with an average of 40 hours of flight time, many of whom had never faced an enemy before the day of their death. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the air from Poland to Normandy, was now launching teenagers into the sky in obsolete, uncoordinated planes with half-full tanks. The Mustangs waited for them patiently. They flew higher, farther, and longer. They surrounded, misled, slaughtered. On many missions, American fighters did not escort bombers. They hunted for anything that had an engine, propeller, or chance to take off. It was not combat. It was industrialized aerial suppression. While the Luftwaffe was bleeding, the United States was training 11,000 pilots a month. Not per year, per month. Each training base in the United States operated as a living production line. Pilots learned meteorology, navigation, combat tactics, emergencies, and operational discipline in controlled, replicable environments. They finished the course ready to fly Mustangs with confidence, and with colleagues next door who shared the same standard of excellence. Germany, short of fuel and time, reduced its training course to a few weeks. The average lifespan of a new pilot has dropped to less than 30 days at the front. There was no way to sustain that. Heaven is no longer a shared domain. It became an occupied territory. In post-war accounts, Luftwaffe officials were unanimous. It wasn't the genius of the Americans that won. It was their ability to sustain the war, to transform the concept of escort into domain, to build a fighting machine that thought about supply lines before the first takeoff. Every Mustang in the air was the result of a chain that started in aluminum mines, crossed railroad lines, Detroit plants, Texas refineries, bases in England, intelligence commandos, maintenance shops, and parts depots. It was a war won on solid ground, but it manifested itself in the air. The psychological impact of this was profound. Letters from German pilots record the feeling of helplessness. "They are everywhere," wrote one young recruit in March 1945. "We flew and we know we won't come back. Mustangs are not airplanes, they are shadows." It was the end not only of the Luftwaffe, but of an era. The myth of German technical superiority, forged in the skies of France and Russia, had been shattered by a machine made to last and to adapt. What the Germans called American inferiority turned out in a few months to be a model of war that could not be stopped. And the war was not yet over. Because with the skies under control and enemy runways in ruins, there was only one final step left: to turn air dominance into ground collapse. And for that, the Mustangs had one last mission. Berlin fell before the tanks. It fell when the sky was no longer yours. By the time Mustangs began flying over the Reich capital in formation with intact B-17s, with no real opposition, the ideological collapse of the Luftwaffe was already irreversible. What had begun as laughter on German fighter radios ended in silence in the diaries of its officers. The Air Force that prided itself on technical superiority, tactical daring, and absolute air dominance found itself crushed not by an airplane, but by a system. The P-51 Mustang was just the visible symbol of an invisible cog. a network of steel, oil, calculations, and logistics that the Germans had no way of replicating. The war was not won in the cockpit. It was won in the factories, refineries, cargo ships, parts depots, training camps, and miles of pipelines that supplied the skies. The Mustang was just the tip of the spear. The whole arm was America. And therein lies the universal lesson. In modern warfare, the best pilot does not win. He who can sustain him wins. Strategy is not only made of maneuvers, but of maintenance. It is not enough to fly better. It is necessary to fly more, to fly far, to always fly. Germany, brilliant in engineering, ignored the cost of continuity. The United States, pragmatic and ruthless, turned logistics into doctrine, supply into weapon, and volume into victory. In the end, it wasn't talent that the Germans lacked, it was time. And time in war is measured in liters, in ammunition, in mechanics, in production shifts. When Hermann Göring said years later, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew that the war was lost," he was not just talking about an airplane. He was talking about an era that ended there. If you've made it this far, leave your like and sign up to support the research and the search for historical truth. Tell us in the comments, what was the most shocking data in this video? Ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Because history, as we've seen, isn't just about heroes and battles, but of systems that work and arrogance that collapses. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.